What would you do if you were trapped in a place where hope was a memory, a ghost that haunted the concrete and steel? Elias Thorne did not have to imagine such a place. He lived it. He breathed its stale, recycled air and tasted its bitterness in every meal. His world was a cage, not just of iron bars, but of a grief so profound it had calcified around his soul, turning him into something hard and impenetrable. He was a man who had declared war on grace, who sneered at faith, and who found a perverse comfort in the cold, hard certainty of his own damnation. It started, as these things often do, not with a thunderclap, but with a whisper of sickness in the dark. And it ended with a light in his cell that had no earthly source, a light that would shatter the prison he had built inside himself long before any court had sentenced him to one of stone. The state penitentiary was a monument to forgetting. It was designed to make the world forget the men inside, and to make the men inside forget the world. Elias had been a resident for 12 years, for months, and 6 days. He counted. The counting was a ritual, a way to impose order on the chaos of a life sentence. His crime was a thing of shadow and fire, a moment of rage that had consumed his past and incinerated his future. He never spoke of it. He never had to. It was written in the permanent tightness around his eyes and the way he held his hands, as if forever bracing for an impact that had already happened. His faith had died long before he arrived. It had bled out on a rain-slicked highway beside the twisted metal of a family car. He had prayed then, screamed prayers to a silent, empty sky, and the silence had been his only answer. God, he had concluded with the certainty of a zealot, was either a cruel joke or an empty word. In prison, he saw this belief confirmed daily. He watched men clutch rosaries like lifelines as they sank deeper into despair. He heard them sing hymns in the chapel, their voices thin and reedy against the thick walls, and he would laugh. It was a low, bitter sound, a sound of disgust. Singing to the warden won't get you an early parole, he would mutter to anyone who would listen. And he's more real than who you're singing to. His cynicism was a shield, and it was effective. Men left him alone. The guards saw him as predictable, a burnt-out case who would cause no trouble because he expected nothing, hoped for nothing, and therefore wanted nothing. He was a ghost in the machine. In the cell block, there was an old man named Samuel. Samuel was the opposite of Elias. He was a lifer who had found a strange, quiet peace within the walls. He had been inside since before Elias was born, a relic from a different era of crime and punishment. Samuel's hands, gnarled with arthritis, were never still. He was always carving. He would take a smuggled piece of wood, sometimes just a splinter from a broken pallet, and with a shard of sharpened plastic, he would coax a shape from it. His creations were small, crude things, a bird, a dog, a simple cross. But his favorite subject was a woman's face, serene and sorrowful, framed by a veil. "The mother," he would say, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "She listens." Elias would watch him, a smirk playing on his lips. "It's a piece of wood, Samuel. It listens to termites, not prayers." Samuel would just smile, a patient, weary expression that irritated Elias more than any argument could. One day, Samuel finished a new medallion. It was carved from a piece of cedar that had been smuggled in, and it filled the air with a clean, forest scent. The carving was his best yet. The woman's face held a universe of compassion. He held it out to Elias. "For you," Samuel said. Elias recoiled as if offered a snake. "Keep your good luck charms. I make my own luck." "It is not for luck," Samuel corrected gently. "It is for memory. So you remember you are a son." Elias snatched it from the old man's hand, his anger a sudden flare in the gray monotony. He meant to crush it, to throw the pieces back at Samuel's feet. But as his fingers closed around the wood, he felt its smoothness, its surprising warmth. The scent of cedar was sharp and clear. He hesitated. Instead of destroying it, he shoved it deep into his pocket, a piece of foolishness he would dispose of later. He turned and walked away, leaving Samuel watching him with those sad, knowing eyes. The sickness came to the block a week later. It started with a cough, a small sound lost in the cacophony of prison life. It belonged to a boy named Leo. He was barely 20, a first-time offender in for a stupid mistake that had earned him 5 years. He was terrified, out of his depth, and an easy target. But he was harmless, and most of the older inmates left him be. The cough grew worse. It became a ragged, wet sound that echoed in the concrete canyon of the cell block at night. A fever followed, bright and vicious. The infirmary took him for 2 days, then sent him back, dosed with aspirin and antibiotics that did nothing. The prison was overcrowded, the medical ward understaffed. Leo was not a priority. He grew weaker. He lay on his cot, shivering, his breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. The sound of his suffering became the block's unofficial soundtrack. It scraped on every man's nerves. It was a constant, audible reminder of their own helplessness, of how little their lives were worth. The usual bravado and noise of the block began to die down, replaced by a tense, waiting silence, punctuated only by Leo's desperate fight for air. Elias felt an old, familiar anger churning in his gut. He tried to ignore it. He tried to block out the sound. He told himself the kid was weak, that the weak don't survive here. It was the law of the place. But the sound burrowed into him. It reminded him of another sound, another labored breath in a hospital room years ago, a sound that had ended in a terrible, final silence. He found himself clenching his fists in his sleep, his knuckles white. Samuel spent his days in quiet prayer, his own crudely carved rosary moving through his fingers. He ate little, offering his food to others. He would stand near Leo's cell, just standing, as if his presence alone could form a shield. Some inmates mocked him. Others, in their own quiet way, seemed to draw a sliver of comfort from his vigil. Elias confronted him during a meal break. "Still talking to your statues, old man," he hissed, his voice low and sharp. "Look how much good it's doing him. Your mother must be on vacation." Samuel looked up, his face etched with a sorrow that was not his own. "You mock what you do not understand, Elias. You mock because you are afraid." "I'm not afraid of anything." Elias snapped back, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "Yes, you are," Samuel said, his voice unwavering. "You are afraid that you were wrong. You are terrified that there is a love you threw away, and you might have to answer for it." The words struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. He stalked away, the half-eaten food on his tray forgotten. Samuel's words followed him, echoing in his head all day. That night, the prison seemed darker, the air colder. Leo's breathing had become a faint, fluttering whisper. The men on the block knew what that meant. The fight was almost over. A strange quiet fell. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of dread. Men who usually shouted and gambled and argued now sat in silence on their bunks, staring at nothing. The guards did their rounds with a little more speed, their faces tight. No one wanted to be the one on duty when the kid finally gave out. Elias lay on his cot, staring up at the stained concrete ceiling. The silence from Leo's cell was now louder than his coughing had ever been. Elias felt a pressure building in his chest, a scream clawing at his throat. The walls of his cell seemed to be closing in, squeezing the air from his lungs. All the grief he had buried, all the rage he had nurtured for years, rose up like a black tide. He saw his wife's face, his daughter's smile. He felt the phantom weight of his child's hand in his. And he broke. It was not a loud shattering, but a silent, internal collapse. The hard shell of his cynicism cracked, and the raw agony beneath was exposed to the cold prison air. His hand went to his pocket, his fingers closing around the wooden medallion Samuel had given him. He pulled it out. He couldn't see it in the near-total darkness, but he could feel the carved face under his thumb. He could smell the faint, persistent scent of cedar. He thought of the boy dying alone a few cells down. He thought of his own daughter. The two became one in the darkness of his mind. A prayer was torn from him, though he did not voice it. It was a thought aimed at the void, at the cruel, empty sky he had cursed for so long. "Please, not this one. Don't let him suffer like she did. Please." He didn't know who he was asking. He didn't care. It was the plea of a man who had nothing left to lose. He closed his eyes, clutching the small piece of wood so tightly his knuckles ached. He expected nothing. He had learned over and over again to expect nothing. That is when the light began. It was not the harsh, yellow glare of the hallway lights or the cold beam of a guard's flashlight. It started in the corner of his cell, a soft luminescence, the color of a twilight sky in winter, a pale and gentle blue. It grew not in brightness, but in substance, coalescing from a faint mist into a definite form. It did not cast shadows. Instead, it seemed to absorb them, filling the small space with a peace so profound it felt like a sound. Elias's eyes snapped open. His heart hammered against his ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of bone. Fear was his first reaction, cold and sharp. He thought he was losing his mind, that the years of grief had finally fractured his sanity. He sat up, pressing himself against the cold concrete wall, his breath catching in his throat. Within the light, a figure took shape. It was a woman. She was wrapped in a cloak the color of the light itself, and her face was that of the carving in his hand, but alive, breathing, and radiating a sorrow that seemed to hold all the pain of the world. Her eyes found his. There was no accusation in them, no judgment for his years of blasphemy and rage. There was only a mother's pity, a deep, aching compassion that reached across the space between them and touched the most broken part of his soul. She did not speak with her lips. There was no sound in the cell but his own ragged breathing. But a voice bloomed in his mind, a voice that was not a voice, but a feeling of pure and absolute truth, gentle and clear as water. My son waits for you. It was not a command. It was not a threat. It was an invitation, an opening, a statement of a love so patient it had waited for him in the darkest corner of the most forgotten place on earth. And in that moment, the dam of his grief did not just break, it was obliterated. A sob ripped through him, a sound of such raw, primal pain that it felt as if it were tearing him in two. He fell from his bunk to his knees on the cold floor, his head bowed, the wooden medallion pressed to his forehead. Tears streamed down his face, hot and cleansing. They were not just tears for his lost family, or for the dying boy, but for himself, for the wasted years, for the hatred he had nurtured like a precious flame, for the love he had so furiously rejected. He wept until there was nothing left inside him but a hollowed-out emptiness. The light in the corner of the cell slowly faded, not winking out, but receding, like a tide pulling away from the shore, leaving behind the same oppressive darkness as before. But it was different. Everything was different. The cell was the same. The prison was the same. But Elias was not. The crushing weight on his soul was gone, lifted and carried away. In its place was a stillness he had not felt since he was a small boy. A profound, unshakable peace. He remained on his knees for what felt like hours, the medallion still clutched in his hand. The night passed in a state of quiet awe. He felt scoured clean, reborn in the crucible of his own surrender. When the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the high, barred window, he finally rose to his feet. His body ached, but his spirit felt light. The morning routine began with the usual clang of steel doors and shouted orders. But there was a different energy in the air, a buzz of disbelief and confusion. From down the hall, instead of the expected silence from Leo's cell, there was the sound of a voice. A weak voice, but a clear one, talking. A short time later, 2 guards and a medic came rushing down the corridor. They emerged from Leo's cell minutes later, their faces masks of professional bewilderment. The medic was shaking his head, looking at his chart as if it were written in a foreign language. Word spread like wildfire. Leo was sitting up. His fever had broken completely during the night. He was weak and dehydrated, but he was breathing normally. The infection that had been raging in his lungs had, for no discernible medical reason, simply vanished. When asked what happened, the boy could only say that he had a dream. He dreamt a beautiful, sad lady in a blue cloak had sat on the edge of his cot and hummed a lullaby until he fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. The inmates were in an uproar. Some claimed it was a fluke, a coincidence. But they were the minority. Most were silent, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and wonder. They looked at Samuel, who sat calmly eating his breakfast, a small, knowing smile on his face. And they looked at Elias. Elias said nothing. He did not have to. The change in him was as loud and undeniable as a thunderclap. The cynical sneer was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet calm. The hardness in his eyes had melted, revealing the sorrow that had always been there. But it was a sorrow now tempered by something else, something that looked like peace. He moved with a new deliberateness, a new humility. Officer Miller, a guard with 20 years of experience and a deep-seated distrust of inmates, stopped at Elias's cell. He stared at him for a long, silent moment. "Thorne," he said, his voice flat. "What happened last night?" Elias met his gaze without defiance, without his old sarcasm. "I prayed," he said simply. The words felt strange and new on his tongue. Miller grunted, a sound of disbelief. But he saw the wooden medallion clutched in Elias's hand. He saw the tear tracks, now dry, on the man's face. He saw a transformation that his rational mind could not process. He just shook his head and walked away, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Elias Thorne did not become a preacher. He did not stand on a crate in the yard and shout about his salvation. His conversion was a quiet, internal revolution. He started to talk with Samuel, not about dogma or theology, but about forgiveness and grace. He began to listen to the other men, truly listen, hearing the pain and fear beneath their violent posturing. He became a calming presence in a place defined by turmoil. He took up Samuel's hobby, learning to carve. He would take scraps of soap or wood and carve small, simple shapes, giving them to men who were struggling, men on the edge. He never spoke of the light. He never spoke of the lady. He did not need to. His life had become the testimony. The cell block changed. The shift was subtle at first, then undeniable. The level of violence dropped. The guards noted a decrease in fights and disciplinary actions. A quiet sense of community, fragile but real, began to form in the cracks of the prison's brutal structure. Men started talking to each other, sharing stories instead of insults. It was still a prison, a place of punishment and loss. But it was no longer a place without hope. Hope had been smuggled inside, carried in the heart of its most broken man. Elias served 22 years before he was granted parole. He walked out of the gates an old man, his hair gray, his face lined with the years. But his eyes were clear. He carried nothing with him but a small, worn cedar medallion, its features smoothed by 1,000 touches. He had walked into prison a man at war with God. He walked out a quiet servant of his grace, a testament to the fact that light can find its way into the deepest darkness, and that a mother's love is a key that can unlock any prison door. The story of Elias reminds us that no place is so dark that it can extinguish all light, and no heart is so broken that it cannot be healed. Grace often finds us not when we are strong, but when we are utterly defeated and have nowhere left to turn. If this story of faith found in the most hopeless of places moved you, please take a moment to leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that affirm the power of hope and redemption. And if you know someone who might be struggling in their own prison of sorrow or doubt, share the story with them. You never know what light it might let in.